My name is Ellen Vasquez, and the path behind my house was 6 stones long when we moved in 11 years ago. This morning it was 12. My husband does not see it. I am writing this down before I forget any more than I already have. I was a botanical survey contractor for 22 years before I took the job at Hollow Pines. I want to be clear about that at the start, because I am not a person who is impressed by woods. I have surveyed timber tracts in 3 states. I have slept in tents in places where the nearest paved road was 40 miles behind me. I know what a barred owl sounds like. I know what a black bear sounds like moving through dry leaves at 2 in the morning. I know the difference between a fisher and a young bobcat at a distance. None of what happened at Hollow Pines is the kind of thing my training prepared me to misidentify. That is the part that keeps me sitting up. The contract was a small one. A state agency, working with a private conservancy, wanted a vegetation inventory done on a tract of recovering forest north of a place I will call Latimer Run. The tract had been clear-cut sometime in the 1950s and allowed to come back on its own, and the conservancy wanted documentation of what had grown in and where, because there was federal money attached to it. The work was straightforward. Plot the stands, identify species, measure diameters, note understory composition, photograph anything unusual. The pay was decent and the lodging was free, which mattered, because my husband had been out of work for 9 months and we had a daughter starting college in the fall. The lodging was a ranger cabin half a mile inside the tract, off a service road that the state still maintained for fire access. It had a wood stove, a propane refrigerator, a generator for the lights, and a hand pump for water. There was no cell signal. There was a satellite phone in a metal box on the wall with a sticker on it that said it was for emergencies only and that all calls were logged. The cabin was clean. The bunk was made up with sheets that smelled like cedar. There was a binder on the kitchen table with my name written on a sticky note on the cover. Inside the binder were the survey maps, the species checklists, the radio frequencies, and a single laminated page at the very front. I want to describe that page carefully. It had the State Wildlife Agency seal at the top and a date stamp from 4 years before I arrived. It was titled Site Conduct Guidelines, Tract 14B, Hollow Pines. Most of it was ordinary. Carry a radio at all times. Do not leave the cabin in fog if visibility is below 100 feet. Do not approach injured wildlife. Do not feed wildlife. Do not photograph or interact with anyone you encounter on the tract, as the tract is closed to the public. Report unauthorized persons to the ranger station and do not engage. There was a number for the ranger station. There was a number for the county sheriff. There was a number for the conservancy office. And then there was item 9, which was written in the same font and the same agency seal as everything else, but which did not match the tone of the other rules. It said, and I am quoting from memory, "Do not look into the trees between the cabin and the eastern ridge after midnight. If you are outside after midnight for any reason, keep your eyes on the ground or on the cabin. Do not use a flashlight beam above waist height. If you hear movement in the trees, return to the cabin without looking. This is a condition of your contract." I read it twice. I want to be honest about the fact that I noticed it was strange and that I chose not to ask about it. I had been doing this work long enough to know that rural ranger districts accumulate superstitions the way old houses accumulate smells. I had been on tracks before where the locals would not go past a certain creek after dark, or where the maintenance crew would not work the south end of a logging road in November. I had learned, over the years, to nod and write down whatever rule I was given and follow it for the duration of the contract. The people who told you these things were almost always the people who would have to come find your body if you ignored them. Even if the rule made no sense, following it cost me nothing. The ranger who let me into the cabin was a woman in her 50s named Pell. She had short grey hair and a sunburn across the back of her neck that suggested she spent most of her time outdoors with her head down. She walked me through the binder page by page. When she got to item 9, she did not pause and she did not look up at me. She said, "This one is important, more important than the others." She said, "I have worked this district for 19 years and I have never broken it, and I do not intend to." She said, "You can do the work in daylight. There is no reason for you to be outside after midnight. If there is a reason, follow the rule." I asked her, just to be polite, what the rule was about. I did not expect a real answer. Pell did not shrug. She closed the binder, and she looked at the wood stove for a long moment, and then she said, "The tract has a problem with sight lines." She said, "If you give it a line of sight at the wrong time, it uses it." She said, "That is the most I am going to tell you, and I would prefer you did not ask the Conservancy people about it, because they do not like to hear about it, and they will pretend it is not in the binder." Then she left. I heard her truck go down the service road and the engine fade into the hills, and then I heard the ordinary sound of a forest in the late afternoon, which is wind and birds and the small, constant settling of trees. I made myself a cup of bad coffee on the propane stove. I read through my survey plots for the next day. I did not think about item 9 again until I had been at the cabin for 11 days. The work went well for those 11 days. I was up at dawn. I walked my plots. I measured. I photographed. I came back to the cabin in the late afternoon, and I wrote up my notes by the light of the kitchen window. I ate whatever I had brought up from town, and I went to bed early, because there was nothing to stay up for. The generator was loud, and I did not run it past dark unless I needed to. I read paperbacks by a battery lantern. I slept hard. The cabin was warm. The work was satisfying. I was making good progress on the inventory, and I was already thinking about the bonus the Conservancy had hinted at if I finished early. On the 11th night, I woke up because I needed to use the outhouse. The outhouse was 30 feet behind the cabin, on a flagstone path that ran out toward the trees. The moon was about 3/4 full, and the path was easy to follow without a flashlight. I remember being annoyed with myself for drinking tea so late in the evening. I pulled on my boots and my jacket over my sleep clothes, and I went out the back door, and I walked to the outhouse, and I used it, and I came back. On the way back, I did something I had not done on any of the previous 10 nights. I looked up. It was not deliberate. I was not testing the rule. I was not curious. I had been looking at the flagstones because my boots were not laced and I did not want to trip, and as I came up to the back step, I heard a sound from the trees on the eastern side of the path. It was a single sound, very clear. It was the sound of a foot being set down carefully on dry leaves. It was the sound a deer makes when it has heard you and is deciding whether to bolt. I had heard it 1,000 times. My head came up before I thought about it. I looked into the trees between the cabin and the eastern ridge. It was past midnight. I had a flashlight in my jacket pocket, and it was off. But the moon was bright enough that I could see the first row of trunks clearly, and behind them the dark of the deeper woods. I stood there for what could not have been more than 2 or 3 seconds before I remembered the rule and brought my eyes down. I did not see anything. That is what I want to be clear about. There was no figure between the trees. There was no pair of eyes. There was no shape. I looked, and there was nothing to see. And I dropped my eyes, and I went into the cabin, and I latched the door, and I told myself I had been stupid, and that nothing had happened. Because nothing had happened. I went back to bed. I want to walk through the next 2 weeks carefully because the changes were not dramatic at first, and I think it is important to understand how slow it was, how it crept up on me in a way that I kept finding reasons to ignore. The first thing I noticed, the next morning, was that the flagstone path had an extra stone on it. The path between the cabin and the outhouse had been 7 flagstones long. I had walked it twice a day for 11 days. I knew it was 7 because I had counted them once out of boredom while I was waiting for the coffee to boil. On the morning after I looked into the trees, the path was 8 flagstones long. The new stone was at the far end, closest to the outhouse, and it was the same kind of stone as the others, the same grey slate, with the same weathered edges. It did not look new. It looked as if it had been there for years. I told myself I had miscounted. I told myself that twice while I was standing on the path looking at it. Then I went and did my survey work, and I tried not to think about it. The second thing I noticed was on the 3rd day after. I was eating dinner at the kitchen table, and I looked out the back window toward the outhouse, and the path was 9 stones long. I set down my fork. I went out and I counted them. 9. I stood on the back step and I counted them again. 9. I walked the length of the path and I counted them with my boot touching each one. 9. The new stone was again at the far end, and again it looked as if it had been there for years, with moss on the edges and a hairline crack across one corner that I would have remembered if it had been there before. I went back inside and I sat down at the table, and I did not eat the rest of my dinner. I opened the binder, and I read item 9 again. I read it 3 times. I thought about Pell saying the tract had a problem with sightlines, and that if you gave it one at the wrong time, it would use it. I thought about the fact that I had given it one for 2 or 3 seconds, 11 nights ago, and that I had been telling myself for 3 days that nothing had happened. I want to be honest about what I did next, because a person hearing the story would expect me to have called the ranger station, or to have packed up and gone home, and I did neither of those things. I told myself that flagstones do not appear out of nowhere, and that I was a 51-year-old woman with a graduate degree and a daughter starting college, and that I was not going to lose a paying contract because I could not count to 7. I told myself that if there was a problem, I would deal with it when there was a problem. I told myself I had not actually seen anything in the trees, and that whatever Pell had been worried about had not happened, because if it had happened, I would know. I did stop using the outhouse after dark. I started using a chamber pot in the cabin, which I emptied in the mornings. It was not comfortable and it was not dignified, but it meant I did not have to go outside between midnight and dawn, and it meant I did not have to look at the path. For about a week it worked. The path kept getting longer. I stopped counting after it reached 12. I did not want to know. The third thing I noticed was the photographs. Part of my survey work involved photographing reference points at each plot, with a small whiteboard in the frame on which I wrote the plot number and the date. I downloaded the photographs every evening onto a laptop I kept in a dry bag in the cabin, and I backed them up onto a portable drive, because if I lost the photographs, I lost the contract. On the 17th night, I was reviewing the day's photographs, and I found one I did not remember taking. It was a photograph of the cabin. It had been taken from the eastern side of the path, from somewhere inside the first row of trees, looking back at the cabin. The angle was low, maybe 3 feet off the ground. The cabin's back window was lit, which meant the photograph had been taken at night, because I never had the light on in the daytime. The whiteboard was in the frame, propped against a tree trunk. On the whiteboard was written, in my handwriting, the plot number for one of my afternoon plots, and the date of the previous day. I did not take that photograph. I had not been outside the cabin at night since the 11th night. I had not written that whiteboard. The handwriting was mine. The pen strokes were mine. The way I crossed my 7s was mine. I sat with the photograph open on the laptop for a long time. The cabin was very quiet. The generator was off. I could hear the refrigerator's propane regulator clicking. I could hear the wind in the eaves. I could hear, faintly, a sound from outside that I told myself was a branch rubbing against another branch, although I had been in that cabin for 17 nights, and I had not heard that sound before. I deleted the photograph. Then I emptied the recycle bin. Then I disconnected the portable drive, and I deleted it from the backup as well. I sat in front of the laptop for a long time after that, with my hands flat on the table, breathing slowly, trying to make my pulse settle. I do not know why I deleted it. I think I was trying to make it stop being true. I think I had not yet decided whether I was going to admit to myself what was happening. I did not sleep well that night. In the morning I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I made a list of the things I knew, on a blank page in my field notebook, the way I would make a list of survey observations. The path was longer than it had been. A photograph existed that I had not taken. A whiteboard had been written on in my handwriting on a date when I had been asleep. The rule in the binder had been broken, briefly, on a specific night, and the changes had begun within hours. I looked at the list. I read it back to myself. Then I decided, for the first time, to drive out and call someone. I drove the service road out to the nearest place I could get cell signal, which was a pull-out at the top of a ridge about 4 miles from the cabin, and I called the ranger station. I asked for Pell. The woman who answered the phone said that there was no ranger named Pell at that station, and that there had not been for some time. I asked her how long. She said she would have to check. I asked her to check. She put me on hold for almost 10 minutes, and then she came back, and she said that a Ranger Pell had been assigned to that district until about 3 years ago, when she had retired, and that the ranger who handled the Hollow Pines tract now was a man named Briggs. I asked her if I could speak to Briggs. She said Briggs was on leave and would be back in 2 weeks. I asked her if she could confirm that Pell had been the one who let me into the cabin 18 days earlier. There was a pause. She said that according to the duty log, the ranger who had let me into the cabin was Briggs. I told her that was not true. I told her the woman who had let me in had introduced herself as Pell, had walked me through the binder, had told me about item 9. The woman on the phone said she did not know what to tell me, and that the duty log was the duty log, and that perhaps I had misremembered the name. Her voice was patient in the way that customer service voices are patient when they have decided you are not going to be helped. I asked her one more thing. I asked her whether item 9, in the binder, was a real rule, or whether it was something Pell had written in herself. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Then the woman said, in a different tone, "Ma'am, I'm not allowed to discuss the contents of the binders. I would suggest you follow whatever is in it." Then she hung up. I sat in the truck at the pullout for a long time after that. The sun was high and the ridge was warm, and there was a hawk turning in a slow circle over the valley below me. I thought about driving home. I thought about leaving the equipment in the cabin and writing the Conservancy a letter of resignation and telling my husband whatever I needed to tell him to explain why I had abandoned a contract halfway through. I thought about it for a long time. Then I drove back to the cabin, because I told myself I needed to retrieve my equipment, and because there was a part of me that wanted to know what was in the binder that I had not yet read. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened the binder, and I looked at the laminated page with the rules on it. Item 9 was still there. The State Wildlife Agency seal was still at the top. The date stamp was still 4 years old. Then I looked at the other pages. I looked at the radio frequencies and the species checklists and the maps. The maps had small handwritten annotations in the margins, the kind of notes a person who knew the tract well would make. The handwriting in the margins was the same handwriting as on the whiteboard in the photograph I had deleted. It was my handwriting. I had not written in the binder. I had not had the binder before I arrived at the cabin. The binder had been waiting for me on the kitchen table, with my name on a sticky note on the cover. I want to describe the next part carefully, because it is the part that I am still trying to understand. I went back through the binder page by page. The handwriting in the margins was not random. It was annotations to my survey work, plot numbers I had completed, diameters I had measured, species I had identified. The annotations were thorough and they were accurate, and they were in my handwriting, and they had been made, judging by the slight fading of the ink, over a period of months. The binder was 4 years old. The annotations went back on the older pages to dates from 3 years ago. There were plot numbers and species notes from plots I had surveyed in the previous 2 weeks, but there were also plot numbers and species notes from plots I had not yet surveyed, which were on my schedule for the following week. And there were plot numbers and species notes from plots that were not on my schedule at all, that were on the far side of the eastern ridge, in an area the Conservancy had told me explicitly not to enter because it was outside the tract boundary. The notes from the far side of the eastern ridge were the most thorough of all of them. They described stands of trees in detail. They described understory. They described what looked like the foundations of an old structure, possibly a hunting cabin, with measurements. They described, on one page, a clearing where the trees had grown in a circle around an open space about 40 feet across, with a single large stone in the middle that the notes described as weathered, possibly worked, oriented north-northeast, with markings on the upper face that I cannot read, but that appear deliberate. The notes were dated from a week ago. They were in my handwriting. I had not been to the far side of the eastern ridge. I had not crossed the boundary. I had been in the cabin or on my assigned plots every daylight hour for the past 18 days, and I had not made those notes. I closed the binder. I sat at the table. I tried to think. At this point, I considered the possibility that I was losing my mind. I considered it seriously. I am not the kind of person who finds it easy to dismiss the possibility that I am wrong about my own memory. I sat at the table for a long time, and I tried to think of any reasonable explanation for the handwriting, for the annotations, for the photograph I had deleted, for the path that was now 15 or 16 stones long. I could not find one. I could not find a way to make it be something other than what it appeared to be, which was that something was using the hours I was asleep, and possibly the hours when I thought I was awake, to do work in my place. Work that was, by any honest measure, better than the work I was doing. That was the part that bothered me the most. Not that something was out there. Something is always out there. I have worked in enough remote places to know that. The part that bothered me was that whatever it was had not threatened me. It had not approached the cabin. It had not made a sound at the door. It had simply started doing the work, and doing it well, and adding flagstones to the path one at a time, as if it were extending its reach by inches and waiting to see whether I would say anything. I did not call the ranger station again. I think part of me was afraid that if I called, the woman on the phone would tell me that there was no contract for a botanical survey on Tract 14B, that there never had been, that my name was not in any of their records. I would have to decide what to do with that information while sitting alone in a cabin half a mile from the service road. I preferred not to know. I did, however, decide to look again. I want to explain why, because I have thought about it a great deal since, and I do not believe I made the decision the way a person normally makes a decision. The rule said not to look into the trees between the cabin and the eastern ridge after midnight. The rule did not say anything about looking into the trees on the western side, or the southern side, or the northern side. The rule was specific. It named a direction. I had broken it once, accidentally, for 2 or 3 seconds, and the consequence had been that something had started filling in for me, gently, in ways that mostly improved my situation. I told myself that if I broke the rule again, deliberately, and looked for longer, I might learn what was actually out there. I might be able to make a decision about whether to stay or to leave with better information than I had now. That was the reasoning I gave myself at the time. Looking back, I am not sure the reasoning was mine. I am not sure I would have decided that on my own. But I decided it, or something decided it for me, and on the 19th night, I sat up at the kitchen table with the lights off and I waited for midnight. At 12:15 by my watch, I went to the back door, and I opened it, and I stepped out onto the back step, and I looked into the trees between the cabin and the eastern ridge. The moon was almost full. The first row of trunks was clearly visible. Behind them the woods were dark, but not impenetrable. I could see the shapes of the second row of trunks, and the third row, and the small spaces between them. The ground was covered in dry leaves that caught the moonlight in patches. There was a figure standing in the third row of trees. It was not hidden. It was standing in plain view between 2 trunks facing the cabin. It was the size and shape of a person. It was wearing what looked like a jacket and pants in colors that matched the surrounding leaves, the way a hunter's clothing would. Although I could not tell whether it was actually clothing or whether the figure simply had that pattern. Its arms were at its sides. Its head was angled slightly down, the way a person's head is angled when they are reading something at chest height, although there was nothing at chest height for it to be reading. I could not see its face. The angle of the head and the shadow of the trees together kept the face in darkness. I looked at it for what I estimate was 30 or 40 seconds. It did not move. I did not move. The wind moved in the trees above it. The leaves on the ground around it shifted slightly, and the figure did not shift. It was not breathing in any way I could see. It was simply present, in a way that an object is present, except that I had the very clear sense that it was aware of me, in the same way I was aware of it, and that we were looking at each other across the path, and the first row of trunks, and the second row of trunks, and that something was being agreed to in the silence between us that I had not consented to, and could not name. I stepped back into the cabin. I closed the door. I latched it. I sat down on the floor with my back against the door, and I stayed there until dawn. I did not sleep. I listened. There was no sound from the trees. There was no sound at the door. There was only the wind, and the propane regulator, and the slow, ordinary settling of a building at night. In the morning, the flagstone path had been extended to the back step of the cabin. The path no longer ended 30 feet behind the cabin at the outhouse. It now ran the full distance from the outhouse to the back step, and the back step itself was made of the same grey slate as the rest of the stones. The wooden step I had stepped onto and off of for 19 mornings had been replaced. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at it. I did not go down to count the stones. I did not need to count them. I went back inside, and I packed my bag. I took the laptop and the portable drive, and my own field notebook, and a change of clothes. I left the binder on the kitchen table. I left the survey equipment in the shed. I left the food in the cupboard. I left the paperback I had been reading face down on the arm of the chair. I drove out of the tract, and I did not stop until I reached the highway, and I drove home. The drive home took 9 hours. I do not remember most of it. I remember stopping once for gas at a station outside a town I did not recognize. And I remember the cashier asking me if I was all right. And I remember telling her I'd been working outside for too long, and her nodding as if that was a thing people said. I remember pulling into my own driveway in the late afternoon, and my husband coming out to the porch to meet me, and his face when he saw mine. I told him the contract had ended early. I told him I would explain later. He did not push. He has been married to me long enough to know when not to push. I told the Conservancy that I had a family emergency and that I could not complete the survey, and I returned the portion of the advance I had not spent. The Conservancy was understanding. They thanked me for the work I had done. About 6 weeks later, I received a final report in the mail with the Conservancy's seal on it, summarizing the results of the Tract 14B vegetation inventory. The report was thorough and detailed, and it included survey data from plots I had never visited, including the plots on the far side of the eastern ridge. The report was signed by me. The signature was mine. I had not signed it. I called the Conservancy office. I asked the woman who answered whether the report had been submitted by me. She said it had been submitted electronically from my email address, 3 days after I left the tract, and that they had been very pleased with the quality of the work. I asked her if she could send me a copy of the email. She did. The email had been sent at 2 in the morning. The body of the email was polite and professional, and it apologized for the delayed submission, and it explained that I had wanted to make sure the report was complete before sending it. The sign-off was the way I sign emails. The phrasing was the way I phrase emails. I did not write that email. I did not authorize it, and I do not know who did, although I have a guess, and the guess is the part that keeps me sitting up at night. I have been home now for almost 8 months. The work is good for my career. The Conservancy has recommended me to 2 other agencies. I have been offered 3 new contracts on the strength of the Tract 14B report. I have turned all of them down, and I have told my husband that I am retiring from field work, and he is happy about that, because he has wanted me to retire for years. I have not, however, been able to stop checking the back windows at night. I want to explain why. About 3 weeks after I came home, I noticed that the back garden was different. We have a small flagstone path from our back door to the shed where my husband keeps his tools. The path had been 6 stones long for the 11 years we had lived in the house. One morning in the spring, I went out to put compost in the bin, and I counted the stones, because I had started counting stones. There were 7. I stood there in my bathrobe with the compost bucket in my hand, and I looked at the 7th stone, and I felt my chest go very still in a way I recognized. The 7th stone did not look new. It looked weathered. It looked as if it had been there for years. It was the same grey slate as the others. There are now 11. My husband has not noticed. When I asked him gently how long he thought the path had been, he said he thought it had always been about that length, and he looked at me in a way that made me decide not to ask again. I have started keeping the curtains closed on the back windows after dark. I have started using a bedside lamp instead of getting up to use the bathroom at night, because the bathroom is at the back of the house, and the window in the bathroom looks out over the garden. I have started, without quite admitting it to myself, organizing my days so that I am not in the back of the house between midnight and dawn. Last week, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. The photograph was taken from somewhere in our back garden, from a low angle, maybe 3 feet off the ground, looking at the back of our house. The kitchen window was lit. In the kitchen window, you could see me standing at the sink with my back to the camera. The photograph was taken at night. I'm not sure when. I'm not sure I want to know. On the back of the photograph, in my own handwriting, in the way I cross my 7s, someone had written the address of our house and the date of the previous day, and a single line of survey shorthand that I have used for 22 years, which means new plot opened. I have not told my husband about the photograph. I have not told anyone. I have put it in a drawer in my office in an envelope, and I have written on the envelope the words "do not look," in handwriting that I am almost certain is mine. I am sitting at my kitchen table writing this down with the curtains closed and the back door latched. The clock on the stove says it is 14 minutes past midnight. I can hear, faintly from somewhere past the shed, the sound of a foot being set down carefully on dry leaves. the way a deer sets its foot down when it has heard you and is deciding whether to bolt. I am keeping my eyes on the page. I am not going to look up. I am going to finish writing this down, and I am going to close the notebook, and I am going to walk to the front of the house without turning my head, and I'm going to sleep on the couch in the living room, where the only window faces the street. Tomorrow morning, when it is light, I will go out and count the stones in the back garden. I already know what the number is going to be. I already know what I'm going to do about it, which is nothing, because there is nothing to do, and because whatever has been writing in my handwriting has not yet written the part where I refuse.